Before we dive in, I want to add a quick update. This video was pre-filmed before a recent incident where a moving company stole some of my jewellery, amongst other belongings. While it wasn't of high value, the experience only reinforces everything that I discuss in this video about why I no longer feel secure, valued, or protected in the UK. What frustrates me is how little recourse exists for situations like this, from law enforcement to insurance to the general culture of accountability, despite giving so much back as a productive, contributing member of society. If anything, I wish I'd spoken even more about how theft and violation of personal property are just further reasons why so many of us feel like this country no longer works for us. With that said, let's get into the video. But for me, one of my biggest goals remains unchanged, and that is leaving the UK. Now, if you've been watching a while, this goal has been on my mind for quite some time. I first made a video about it a few years ago, discussing my ambitions to leave, and honestly, that desire has only grown stronger. And recently, I've been watching, as you know, a lot of content around crime in London. I've even talked about it on this channel, the rising costs of living, the increase in government surveillance, and reckless spending, and then just adding in my recent travels to countries on the opposite side of the spectrum that many would consider unsafe or unconventional to visit. Yet those countries have surprisingly offered a lifestyle for me that's better, cheaper, and safer than what's currently going on in the UK. I've grown up in the UK, so I have a real sense of nostalgia from where the streets were clean, neighbourhoods were tight-knit and safe, and most families could get by on a single income. And that sense of safety, togetherness, and opportunity was central to why my parents emigrated to the UK, and ultimately what I find to be the root of why I am successful in my career and endeavours. But as I've gotten older, I've realised that times have changed and the UK has really shifted. And while I appreciate the memories of a simpler, safer time, it's really hard to ignore how much the country has deteriorated in recent years. So it is with these thoughts in mind that I wanted to make an updated video with my honest thoughts on the situation, because while I haven't talked about the topic and obviously haven't made the move just yet, for me, nothing has changed. And so that is why I wanted to sit down and have an honest conversation, sharing those reasons with you, especially as I continue to travel more and explore new options for what might be home in the future. Now, the first reason I want to leave, and it's honestly going to be something that I'm sure a lot of you out there may feel day to day, is that it honestly feels like Groundhog Day. And if you haven't watched the film, you probably won't get the reference, but it's the sense of feeling stuck and mentally exhausted in repetitive cycles of monotony. Now, it's probably worth me clarifying at this stage that it's not that I have a bad life. On the contrary, you know, I have a white-collar job, I have wonderful friends, hobbies, so I'm definitely not trying to sound like I'm looking a gift horse in the mouth. It's more about how things have started to feel stagnant for me in my day-to-day. And even with the pace of change that's happening globally, it just felt that my life in the UK has been very much this unchanging loop. I feel like Neo when he's still in the Matrix in front of his laptop screen. A lot of people are weekend warriors. A lot of people turn to substances. People overall just doing jobs that they dislike. They have to stick with it and grit their teeth through it because they have a mortgage or because they have children. Everybody is just stuck, but no one wants to really do anything about it, and no one really can do anything about it in today's cost of living crisis. And this kind of atmosphere really rubs off on you day in and day out. It's not the life that I want. And to get out of that rut, I've invested in self-development, learning new skills, having new hobbies, meeting new people. But the reality is that you can do all of the self-help and hobby classes in the world, but sometimes you need to get out of the environment that's limiting you. And I feel like I've boiled down all of the variables and I've changed so much that I've noticed it's the environment that I'm in, and it's just not conducive for growth, for self-development, compared to even cultures like in the US, whereas the UK is a bit more conservative, more melancholic, probably to do with the weather, let's be honest. Even the US is more entrepreneurial, self-starters. I just don't therefore think that me staying in the UK is where my people are at. Not to say that there's not those individuals in the country, but you're seeing a mass exodus of entrepreneurs, of self-starters, because in the UK it's very much about staying where you are, soldiering through it, and not really encouraging you to stand out. But of course, I am somebody who loves to travel, explore new cultures, meet new people, expose myself to new ways of thinking. And so when you do travel, you start to see the world very differently beyond your bubble. Having traveled across 6 continents in the world and copious numbers of countries, I've honestly noticed a lot of the stereotypes that do come out of Western countries, like they are the first world, that they are the most developed, are patently false. I have been to what are classed as second or third world countries that are honestly the real first world. Cue the Middle Eastern countries, cue Asian countries, as well as even African countries. I honestly do feel sometimes that there is a smear campaign, or at least just a spreading of false information around those types of countries to make them seem less desirable. They pose a threat to the status quo, especially of these name brand Western countries. And if people were to realize the value and the conditions that you can live under if you were to emigrate, actually there would be a mass exodus of people leaving. Because if you were to really be honest with yourself and take a look around in the UK or just in the Western world, ask yourself, do people push your boundaries, allow you to try new things, or get you outside the norm? Or is it more about staying comfortable and being safe where you are? Which actually segues really nicely into my second reason why I want to leave, and that's basically the realizations that I've had from traveling during the pandemic. Now, when I filmed that video all those years ago around why I initially wanted to leave the UK, I was actually in, I think, Belgrade. That honestly was a trip that I took not just for the sake of traveling the world and exploring, but because of the restricted nature, especially of the UK government. For those of us that didn't want to take experimental vaccines, there was a real chance that we weren't going to be able to travel, potentially ever. That just honestly seemed to be a breach of free will. And nowadays, I feel like we are in a place where we can talk freely about that. At the time, it was seen to be a witch hunt, and it really brought out the worst parts of humanity. And I was very, very surprised and concerned and shocked by how far the UK citizens were willing to take COVID restrictions and even enforce it amongst themselves. And that is obviously manifested in the fact that lockdown lasted almost 3 years, which obviously could not have happened without the consent of its people. So obviously with that in mind, the restrictions on travel, it just made me realize the kind of fragility of time. Before lockdown, I used to think I'd always have time to travel, to explore, to try new things. But once it was taken away, I realized just how fragile time and indeed life is. And we really don't know what we have until it's gone. And I was living alone at the time too, which made the feelings even more compounded. And that just really made me realize I shouldn't wait. And it honestly felt at the time, with the way politics was going, that traveling, one last time might actually be the best idea. So that's when I went to the Balkans. Obviously, fast forward many months and years, we've obviously seen a big pushback to the lockdowns. And so in reference to leaving the UK, this is clearly something that I've wanted to do for quite some time. I honestly thought I could just, take my sweet time about and wait till the time is right. But truthfully, there is never a right time. You've got to make the time. And I don't want to look back in a few years' time thinking I should have left earlier. And it does feel actually that with the legislation the UK is considering around exit taxes for entrepreneurs or even more taxes for higher earners, that this is the direction that the country is taking. So there does seem to be a closing door when it comes to leaving the UK that I really don't want to miss. Now for my third reason why I want to leave the UK, and that's because it's just feasible to live outside of it, namely thanks to remote working. That's one thing that we can thank COVID and lockdowns for. One of the key realizations that I've had in the last few years is how feasible it is to work remotely and make a good living doing so. With technology today, I can do my job and make a living without being physically tied to a location. And for somebody who values independence and flexibility, that is a game changer, because working remotely means I can live anywhere. And this brings such a sense of freedom that I couldn't have imagined just a few years ago. I mean, imagine being able to travel, live in different countries, experience different cultures, while still running your business or doing your job from anywhere in the world. And for me, this flexibility and freedom of movement opens up so many more opportunities, not just in my job, but also in my kind of social life and well-being, than just staying in the miserable UK weather fixed to my desk. And this segues very nicely into my next reason, which is that of the cost of living. I mean, the cost of living in the UK in itself is insane, especially in cities like London. But in other countries I've visited, life is so much more affordable and you get so much more for your money. So here's a recent statistic I came across. In 2023, the average monthly rent for a one-bed flat in London was about $2,200 per calendar month. Compare that to countries like Portugal or Thailand, where similar accommodations can be found for just £400 to £600 a month. Not only that, but things like food, transport, and even healthcare are significantly cheaper abroad, which means I can save more while getting more and subsequently investing more in my future. Now moving on to my fourth reason, and that's basically around the political, economic, and social decline of the UK, just the overall collapse of Western civilization as we know it. Safe to say the direction in the UK is heading somewhere that doesn't align with my personal values. I see a lot of political instability. Case in point, we've literally had like 10 prime ministers the last 3 or 4 years alone, a creeping cost of living crisis, and a heavy-handed government. From the excessive taxes to the constant surveillance investments that they're making, it feels like our freedoms are slowly eroding. What we're getting is not what we pay taxes for. And honestly, because of the melancholic atmosphere that I mentioned earlier, it feels like the spirit of the UK is muted, if I'm being quite honest. There is no sense of fight in this country. It feels like no one has the spirit, especially given we don't have the weather. I mean, come on, there's word of social credit scoring systems, there's heightened surveillance in our cities. London is the most surveyed city in the world. The spread of ULEZ across the UK, even charges like pay per mile for drivers is being entertained. It's becoming harder and harder not to think that we're living in a 1984 novel. And it just feels like the encroachment from government is more and more, and no one is doing anything about it. So for me personally, building a future in the UK is becoming an uphill battle to justify. And it's not good enough just to have the nostalgia of the UK being a driving force to stay here. The cost of home ownership, combined with these taxes, are amongst the highest in Europe. So it makes it so difficult to imagine having a stable future and raising a family here. I mean, take the average house price in the UK. It's skyrocketed to an average of $285,000 in 2024, which is a huge jump from around $180,000 in 2015. And that's not even counting the rising stamp duties, maintenance costs, increasingly high interest rates that make mortgages even more expensive than ever. It's safe to say I've had a rude awakening that life in the UK is not what it's like, and it's not one that I can afford, nor want to afford. There's no real sense of fight, like I mentioned, to change the status quo. It's not as entrepreneurial in the UK as it is in America or in other parts of the world that are, you know, not a name brand country, so they're not going to be able to rely on the reputation. They actually have to get creative, take risks. And I want to be surrounded by people like this. And ultimately, these attitudes, these thoughts that I've even mentioned thus far have culminated in my last reason. And it's a somewhat depressing one. It's just a sense of stagnation and helplessness, because as much as I want to believe that I can change the system or that, you know, things will get better, the truth is that the UK feels like it's already reached a point of no return. Government officials aren't suddenly going to wake up and put the people first. And I'm just not willing to wait around for a change that will realistically never come. But while I can't control the actions of others, I can, however, control my own. And honestly, the prospect of moving out of the UK and venturing to lands unknown is so exciting to me. It opens up so many opportunities and builds a future that is much more aligned with my values. And I personally think, even though I've had great memories in the UK, that it's time to move on. I will always be grateful to this country for what has allowed me to create a lifestyle that I've only ever dreamed of. But I can't live in the past. I have to prepare my future, my children's future. For me, I face the daily reality that the UK, for all its history and its promise, it's clear the country is struggling to move forward or even unite for that matter. And the challenges I've outlined thus far, whether it's to do with the rise in crime, especially in cities like London, or the sheer frustration of paying exorbitant taxes for public services that either aren't up to par or I'm not even eligible to use, have made me realise that this country isn't providing the opportunities or the safety that I need. And it's really frustrating to know that even in places like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, or even Rwanda that I've been, these countries are often grossly misrepresented by the media because, in contrast, their citizens enjoy a higher level of safety and more efficient services while paying far less in taxes. And yet I'm out here giving so much more. I'm giving 40% in taxes and I am getting zilch in return. Plus I'm out here on these streets clutching my belongings in the fear that somebody is going to steal it or worse. And don't even get me started around the lack of cleanliness in this country. We're seeing that go downhill too. Meanwhile, I can literally eat my dinner off of the floors of the second and third world countries that are so often mischaracterized as being behind and backward. To be honest, the UK is the true third world country. And so that's where I'm ultimately left asking myself, what am I staying here for? I mean, if the UK takes so much from me but offers so little return, then why should I stay in an environment that is draining me, literally and figuratively? I'm not out here about to be a Stockholm Syndrome citizen, okay? And I personally really enjoy nomad capitalists' famous philosophy, famous quote of go where you are treated best. It's one that I live by now more than ever because I want to be in a place where my ambition is rewarded, where the environment actually nurtures success, promotes innovation, where I feel safe, valued and supported, where I see a future for my children. Ultimately, this isn't just about leaving the UK. It's about choosing a life that truly reflects who I am and what I want to achieve. And so for me, this next step is super exciting because it's just the beginning, with the hope that my experiences can help those of you out there who are also considering making a change. Change, of course, takes time, but taking action now, no matter how small, is going to ultimately allow us to create the life that we have dreamt of. And I'd personally rather be a year too early in my move than a day too late. But with my monologue aside, I'd love to hear from you. Have you considered leaving your current environment? And what would it take for you to make that leap? Drop your thoughts down in the comments because I would love to read it and I'm sure your stories would be helpful to others too. Thank you as always for watching and I will catch you in my next one.